Okay, this is about updating the firmware in the EZUHF transmitters and receivers. And this is a transmitter here. It's a module, JR module, but you also know there's one that looks like a box that you can mount on the back of your radio, and that does the same function as this, all the same features and everything. And in case you don't want to watch this entire video, I'll tell you what the real trick to this whole thing is about updating the firmware on only the transmitters but also the receivers. Is before you plug in the USB cable, you need to hold this button down on the back here, or on the receiver there's a little button next to the servo plugs. But the thing is, if you don't hold that button down and you plug in the wire, you can install a device driver, but you can't update the firmware. It won't let you update because the config tool button won't be activated, and you can't. And it was really puzzling for me. So then I held in the button and did it the right way, and you know, held in the button, plugged in the USB port the right way, and I still wasn't able to update, even though I just installed the device driver. And the truth is, when you get in this firmware mode by holding in the button and plugging it in, you have to install the driver at that point. The previous driver that I installed without the firmware mode didn't count. I mean, I'd have to start over. And the other thing is that the driver is in the folder with the config tool. So you basically manually install the driver. You go into Device Manager and find, you know, the COM port that showed up when you plugged in the USB cable, and right click and update that driver for the USB port. And like I say, that driver can be found in that folder with the config tool from ImmersionRC. So that's the short of it. Now I'll show you, you know, completely how I did it. And I'm not only going to update the firmware on two of my transmitters and my receiver, but I'm also going to show you how to bind the transmitter and receiver afterwards. So it's all kind of interesting, and you can use the config tool actually to do the binding instead of holding down the button on your receiver. You can just leave the receiver plugged into the computer, and there's a bind button you can press to make it bind. It saves a few steps. But anyway, I already killed a bunch of time now, and this video is going to be like 20 minutes long. But anyway, that's the start of it.
So to update your EZUHF firmware, what you do is go to ImmersionRC.com right here, this link right here. And then when you get there, go to the products page, and then find the device that you want to update. Now in my case, it's going to be the EZUHF long range receiver, the light version right here. What I've actually done is I've purchased the EZUHF Jr module, like it said, that has the 1.50 firmware, and I need to make my receiver match that so that they will bind. Right now they're not binding. I also have this product over here, which is my previous transmitter. I may still use that, and I'll probably update that too with 1.50, so they'll all have the same firmware. So this module is going into my FrSky Taranis radio, and I just want to bind it to my EZUHF Lite receiver here. So what I do is select the product I want to update. In my case it's this one, and go to that product page, and then scroll down, and you'll see firmware downloads. Click on that and go to the firmware downloads page. Now on the firmware downloads page, what you do is download the latest firmware, and in my case it's 1.50 right here. So I will download that by clicking on this zip file over here, and then I'll also download the latest tool, which is 1.40, and you'll need the tool to install the firmware. So I'm going to download both of those. So there's that one downloading, and let's download this one as well. So we got the tool and we got the firmware. So let's move these tools and firmware out to the desktop. So I'm going to show folder, and there's the Immersion Tools. Let's move that out there. And now let's go to this one. And there's the firmware. Move that out there. Okay. Now that's all that we need from this site, so I'm just going to go ahead and close that. Now let's get these out here where we can see them. Okay, the first thing to do is just open up the tool, the zip file, and just go ahead and install it. Okay, once the program is installed, you can just go ahead and click Finish. What I'm going to do is I don't really want to launch the program right now, so I'm going to uncheck that, and then I'm going to click Finished. Alright, so that's that. Next, let's work on the firmware. Now here's the firmware versions right here. There's also an older version of the tool in there, and you don't really need that. I'm just going to delete that out of there. So these are the firmware for the different modules. I'll be using the 8-channel light version for the United States, which is right here. And there's also a UK version. So the best thing to do at this point is just copy these into the directory where your tool just installed. So to do that, what I'm going to do is bring this out. I'm just going to go to my computer here, C drive, and I'm going to go down to Program Files x86, and I'm going to find the ImmersionRC folder right here, the ImmersionRC Tools, and I'm going to put those firmware files right in there. So just hitting Control A to copy them, right click, move them over, let go, and I'll just say copy here. And let's see. Yeah, it just wants administrator rights, so I'll just copy them. Got to provide administrator rights for every one of them, I guess. I can say do this for all current items. There we go. So they're all in there now. Okay, now let's see, did it make me a desktop icon? I don't think it did, so let's just go ahead and make a desktop icon for the application file. So I'll bring that over and create a shortcut. Alright. Okay, so that completes that step. Okay, now that we have the Immersion Tools installed and the firmware copied into its folder, we can just go ahead and delete these zip files, or I'm just going to delete them, but they'll be in the trash if I want them back. So there we go. Now I just have the icon, the shortcut to the tool, so I'm going to launch the tool by double-clicking the icon. Okay, let's open up Device Manager right here. Go to right-click on my computer, go to Manage, go to Device Manager. This is in Windows 7, by the way. It's similar in other Windows versions. And now as you plug in the USB cable from the receiver, what you will see is the COM port category will pop up here. You open that up. Now that's your actually is your EZUHF right there, but it doesn't have the driver installed. So what you do is you use the driver that came with the tool. It's in the folder with the tool. So what you do is update driver software, go browse my computer, go to where the tool is located, which we now know is under Program Files. So we go into here, C drive, go down to Program Files x86, go to ImmersionRC right here, ImmersionRC. And once you're in ImmersionRC, go to the tool right here, and then just click OK, and next, and it should find the driver, which it did, and then you just say install, or click install, and now it says it's done, successfully installed. Now once it's installed, you can come back over here and see that the tool is now picking up that USB port. You can refresh it and you'll see it's now picking up the driver because we installed the driver. Now this is good. So now we come down to the item that we want to update. In my case it's the 8-channel light right here. Now if you want to find out what your firmware settings are, you can go to the config tab here and say read settings, and it'll tell you after it reads the settings what your firmware version is. Now mine was 1.43, which was wrong, and I previously updated it, so it's 1.5 now, which is what I wanted. But I'm just showing you how I did it. So what you do now, or what I did now, which was actually wrong, I went here to the Program tab, which is where you're supposed to be, but the Update Firmware button is not activated. And there's a little trick to this whole thing to get this firmware button to activate and allow you to upload the firmware or update the firmware. And that is that when you connect the USB cord, you have to hold the button in on the receiver and then plug in the cord, and you should get a flashing light. Unfortunately, the driver that we just installed has to be reinstalled for that mode too, or it won't work. And I went and spent like an hour trying to figure out why there was nothing down here anymore, because there was no driver for the firmware mode. In other words, when I hold the button in and plug it in, it's a different mode than when I don't hold the button in. So the firmware mode, you hold the button in and then you plug it in, and you have to reinstall the driver again. So I'll show you how to do that next.
Okay, let's just go ahead and connect up our receiver, and I have this red wire right here, USB cable, it's a mini USB cable. So I'm holding the button in with the stick, and then I plugged in the USB cable, and you can see that the light is on solid. Now I'm going to let go of the button. And you can see down here there is no device found. So we need to reinstall the driver.
Now back in Device Manager, after holding the button and plugging in the USB cable, you can see we have other devices, unknown device. So we need to update the driver again. It doesn't even know what it is. So we browse to my computer, and it's already at the ImmersionRC Tools folder. So we can just hit Next and reinstall the driver. Now we have a device driver for that. And you can see once the device driver is installed, we have a blinking light right there. And that means that we're connected in firmware mode, ready to update. And that's the whole trick. And you can see when I refresh, I actually have a button now right here. And I can do update firmware. Now I just need to pick my device, which is this the EZUHF 8-channel light, and then open that, and then it says programming, and you can see the bar going across there, and then it says success. Now, interesting enough, we go back to configure and we try to read the settings right here. Let's see if we can read the settings. It did read the settings as far as I can tell. So font 1.50 is what we have. So that's basically the whole trick to it. You really have to hold the button down when you plug in the USB cable. Of course, that's in the documentation. But what it doesn't tell you is you have to load the driver up, because it doesn't automatically load the driver, and you have to get that driver out of the folder from the ImmersionRC Tools. So that's how it all works, and now that unit is updated.
Okay, let's take it out of firmware mode by just unplugging the cable. The light goes out. Now let's plug it back in. Light comes back on.
Yeah, I just want to show you this little trick with the bind tab. You can go to the bind tab and actually use this bind button to bind to your radio or your transmitter. So the first thing we need to do is put the EZUHF module in bind mode on the radio. So let's do that first.
So here's my EZUHF Jr module on the back of my Taranis. Now this is a little tricky because you have to hold this button in long enough so that you get continuous beeps. Okay, here's my EZUHF Jr module on the back of my Taranis radio. Now to start the bind process, we have to put it in low power mode. We move that switch down. Then we have to hold this button while powering on the radio. Whoop, wait a minute.
Welcome to Taranis.
Okay. Now we want to get continuous beeps. Just keep holding. You'll hear 3 beeps, then wait a while, and then when you hear it beeping slowly like that, you can let go of the button. Okay. Now we're going to bind the radio to the receiver by using the ImmersionRC Tools, which is a little easier to do than trying to hold the buttons and everything. So let's do that.
We just already have the receiver plugged into the USB port. It's not in firmware mode anymore. It's just in regular mode in the USB port. And we hit this bind button. Okay. And just let it go. It takes a few minutes. And there it says binding succeeded. Now it says remove USB cable and cycle the power on your RX.
Okay, so we'll do that. We'll remove the USB cable. And then we'll turn off the transmitter. And turn it back on.
Welcome to Taranis.
Okay, now we're going to need to power up the plane. In my case, it's a plane. Alright, now I've got the blinking light on the receiver there showing that it's working. Okay, now I'm going to update the firmware on this transmitter. I don't need to update the JR module because it's already up to date. But this works basically the same way, and I like to update my old transmitter so it's also got the 1.5 firmware in it. So let's go ahead and plug it up to the computer and see what we can do. Now the transmitter updates pretty much the same as the receiver. You got to hold this button in while you plug in the USB cable and you'll get a blinking red light. That's if you got the driver installed. If you don't have a blinking red light, install the driver as I showed you through Device Manager. Now as you can see, I'm holding the button and the light is blinking because I plugged it into the USB port. Now I can let go of the button. Alright, now let's go ahead and update it. You can see here that the update button is now active.
The red light on the transmitter is blinking because it's plugged into the USB port. And the update firmware button is active. We got our driver installed. And if I refresh this down here, should be able to refresh it. Still says no device found, but the driver is installed, which is kind of a fooler. Anyway, you go to update firmware, and what I'm going to do is pick this TX500 firmware. That's the one for mine, the 500 milliwatt TX, even though I think it's a 600. But anyway, that's the one. You open that, and it says programming. And we have success right there.
Okay, the light was blinking slowly during the firmware update, and now it's gone to solid once the update is done. And we can go ahead and just unplug the USB cable, and that completes it. So there's all the steps for updating your firmware on UHF, the EZUHF transmitters and receivers. It's not too hard to do, but there is that caveat that you have to have the driver installed for the firmware mode, which is when you hold the button in and plug it into the USB port. So that's the real trick. Other than that, it's pretty much as the steps are on the internet, and I'll post some links under the video to some of those steps so you can see what I read. Thanks for watching.